I think we can start, and let me introduce you, Professor Vanessa Lemm. Of course, just to let you know once again that this talk will be recorded today. Professor Vanessa Lemm is an honorary professional fellow at the University of Melbourne and fellow at the Royal Society of New South Wales. She's an eminent Nietzsche scholar, and she has published extensively on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and contemporary political thought, biopolitics, animal and plant studies, theories of justice and the gift. She's the editor of the Nietzsche Studien, and she is the author of the influential recent study, Homo Natura, Nietzsche, Philosophical Anthropology and Biopolitics from Antibody University Press. Her talk today is on Nietzsche, particularly related to truth, embodiment, and consciousness. Professor Lemm, the floor is yours, and thank you so much in advance from all of us here at the Institute of Philosophy and Technology and our participants for this talk.
Look, Giannis, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to share with you some thoughts on Nietzsche, albeit 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. So what I would like to propose for today is I want to talk, basically the title of my conference has 3 key concepts, truth, consciousness, and embodiment. So what I want to do is basically give a short introduction or presentation of each concept, just a kind of a quick overview of what I take to be sort of the key insights that we can draw from Nietzsche's work that are relevant, but also the way I approach those concepts. And then I'll try to tie them together in a narrative that hopefully will shed, again, bring a new perspective to Nietzsche's thinking about truth, consciousness, and embodiment. And I should say right away that I'll end with more questions than answers. So rather than presenting sort of final thoughts on this topic, I'll end more with what I take to be some of the key questions that are still with us and that I think we need to be engaging with on this particular topic. So I'll kick off. So on the concept, let me start with the concept of truth, which is, of course, a very complex one, and we will not be able to tease out all the various dimensions of Nietzsche's philosophy of truth. So I just want to say a few things. Typically, often Nietzsche has been seen as a sort of anti-metaphysician, denier of truth, as someone who actually does not have an affirmative conception of truth. I think that this is false. And the way that I approach this is that, yes, it's true that there's no coherent, homogeneous discourse on truth in Nietzsche's philosophy. However, we can distinguish with what I've called sort of 3 different genres or 3 different type of discourses in Nietzsche's work on truth. So the first, and they are to some extent incommensurable, so we really need to look at them separately, but to some extent, of course, they're all related to each other, and this will come out, I hope, today in my presentation as well. So the first discourse on truth, we can say, is of theoretical nature, and it's part of the genre of the critique of metaphysics. And in this particular genre, Nietzsche approaches the question of truth from the vantage point of ontology and cosmology, pursuing the classical question of philosophy of what there is. Now, investigating this question of what there is reveals the world to be lacking in metaphysical reality, that is, a world without a highest being or a most real being which functions as the ground of beings in their totality. So in this sense, Nietzsche's discourse or critique of metaphysics reveals basically, is often associated with the famous formula of the death of God, that is, the ground of all absolute foundations is withdrawn, and we are confronted with the question of how to live after the philosophy, after the death of God, or what does it mean to undertake, to be pursuing the questions of philosophy after the death of God. So this theoretical discourse is immediately linked, if you wish, in Nietzsche, or not separable from what I call a practical discourse on truth. This practical treatment of truth in Nietzsche belongs to what I call the genre of social criticism, or what could be called a critical theory of society. And here, truth, when Nietzsche talks about truth in this, let's say, context of social criticism, and one of his early texts, for example, on truth and lies in an extra moral sense, is the perfect example of this kind of critical theory or social criticism of truth. Now, in this context, truth refers to what I call the basic normative presupposition of all social beings living together and all communicative actions among human beings. So through this social criticism, and this genre is particularly important for his conception of consciousness, to which I will get in a moment. So through social criticism, Nietzsche investigates the operation of a will to truth in the constitution of social order and political power. And with this kind of discourse on truth, Nietzsche resembles, of course, an Enlightenment thinker. So this is a really whole Enlightenment motif as well that is associated with his discourse on truth that goes throughout his work, that seeks to unmask power formations and ideological constructs. These are the famous Götterdämmerung, by exposing how the domination on the violence and injustice really that is central to the establishment of truth that can function as the basis of civil society. Finally, so that's the second discourse on truth, genre. Finally, there's I distinguish what I called a biopolitical treatment of truth. I call it biopolitical on the one hand because I think it is a direct response to this social criticism. It is based on a critical movement, but then response to this this critical movement is followed by what I call the sort of an affirmative movement. And here it is about returning, I would say, so it's a double gesture of pointing towards the future of philosophy and the figure of the future philosopher, the figure of the free spirit, and really thinking about what kind of philosophical life these figures represent. And this forward gesture is also a backward gesture. So this is where Nietzsche will return to sort of pre-Socratic ideals of the philosophical life as an example of a kind of an honest or pure, as he calls it, in the truth and lies in an extra moral sense. This is the moment when my cat wants to do philosophy, okay? All right, we'll just have to let her do that. All right. So basically, yes. So this is the return to a kind of pre-Socratic idea of the philosophical life as an example of what Nietzsche calls this pure and honest drive for truth. That's in his early Truth and Lies in the extra moral sense, and throughout his work he will refer to as redlichkeit or probity. So here, this I have been comparing this virtue, if you want to call it a virtue, or this kind of discourse on truth with the Greek paresia and Foucault's analysis of paresia. So here it's really about rethinking the role of truth has in the life of the mind that overcomes the kind of truth that's associated with sort of social norms, but also with the errors of the metaphysical worldview. So in this, what I called in my early work, the sort of biopolitical treatment of truth, we have a response, kind of an affirmative gesture towards this critique of metaphysics. So we don't want to fall back into the era of the history of philosophy, but and at the same time we are it reflects that critical perspective that we saw in the second discourse on truth that is associated with social criticism. So here, affirmative gesture that Nietzsche has also referred to as philosophy as an art of transfiguration. So the idea of transfiguration and transformation is central to this, let's say, new conception of the philosophical life that is, of course, inspired by the pre-Socratics. So here, the idea of redlichkeit, or honesty, or truthfulness, Wahrhaftigkeit, as now exemplified by this sort of irreducible singular entanglement of life with thought, which characterizes a philosophical life, and that overcomes both the metaphysical, epistemological, and psychological requirements of the will to truth in its effort to provide unquestionable foundations to social order and political power. So here I think it's very important to note that this discourse on the philosophical life does not operate in a vacuum, but it is, since you are, we're here at least virtually in Athens, it is a discourse that is located at the heart of the polis, and is a discourse on the agora, and in that sense, it is political. In my latest work, I have tried to approach this question of the philosophical life in relation to truth through the lens of philosophical anthropology, and in this sense, this reflection on the figure of homo natura and human nature is in my last book related to this question of the philosophical life as well. But I'll get to this in a little moment as well. I'll touch on it at least. So much for the question of truth. Okay. Now let me say a few things about Nietzsche's concept of consciousness, and I will broaden it a little bit to include as well some of his claims about the human intellect, because both, if you wish, Nietzsche's discourse is in the first instance a very critical one, a very provocative one, let's say. So I'm sure you all recall, and it has to do with, and this is again a motif that it starts with truth and lies in an extra-moral sense, so very early text Nietzsche, but you find very similar gestures all the way through to the Antichrist that have all to do with, in fact, demonstrating that human consciousness and the human intellect, which we took to be the pride of our human distinction, are in fact inferior functions. And they are in fact point to a weakness of the human being rather than its strength. So there's a lot of irony here, or yes, but at the same time, I think we can draw from this repositioning of the human being, as he calls it in the Antichrist, back among the animals, as well, again, a positive approach to the question of human nature and the consciousness and the intellect. So in Truth and Lies, as you may know the text, if you don't, I recommend it. Untruth and Lies in an extra-moral sense, as you maybe recall, begins with this very provocative claim that when considered from the perspective of life, and here he means life like from the perspective of the cosmos, other than human life, we would say perhaps today, the intellect, quote, is this pitiful, he says in German, kläglich, insubstantial, schattenhaft, transitory, flüchtig, purposeless, and arbitrary entity. Nietzsche ironically contrasts this perspective with the traditional view, of course, of the intellect and of consciousness as an emblem of the human being's distinction from and superiority to other forms of life because of its purported capacity to represent reality correctly. And of course, the capacity, of course, that to produce knowledge. So Nietzsche casts doubt on these claims by adopting very funnily, ironically, the perspective of other animals, wondering whether the human being's sentimental pride in its intellectual capacity can be compared to that of the midge, right? And I just quote the sentence: if we could communicate with a midge, we would hear that it too floats through the air with the very same pathos that it too contains with itself the flying center of this world. End of quote. So I'm not going to go too much into the detail of this particular text, but essentially I think you get the idea that there's Nietzsche sort of undermines the cognitive capacities of the human being. What is it? That's the starting point. Then, of course, the text continues and Nietzsche has more to say about the intellect and consciousness. I think the key points are the following. First is that actually our reliance on the intellect or on consciousness is revelatory of our inferiority and relative weakness with respect to other forms of life. So in fact, from the perspective of life, the intellect fulfills primarily a life-preserving function. It's, so to speak, as he says, the aid of the most unfortunate, most delicate, and most transient beings, so as to detain them for a minute within existence. So this is how Nietzsche sets out in sort of his early text. The motif continues. So for example, in The Gay Science, he will now talk explicitly about consciousness, and he will again make a similar claim, saying that consciousness really is an insufficiently developed organ. He says it can even be dangerous, and in comparison, unconsciousness is much more, he ranks it much higher, because most of our vital functions, if you wish, operate perfectly without consciousness. So there's something about the unconscious that is much more essential, much more vital to life than the human being's consciousness. And this is, of course, here this interest in the unconscious is something that that Nietzsche shares with Freud, or Freud shares with Nietzsche. Yeah, which is, of course, why their approach to human nature has often been compared. The idea here again is that here in this particular context, and I think it's important, is that the extension of the sort of unconscious signals that there's a distance between what we can know and what we cannot know about life, but also about the world, but also about our own human nature, our own life. So there's, from the very beginning, Nietzsche, when he introduces consciousness and unconsciousness, it is also to mark a limit. Having said this, Nietzsche actually doesn't have a problem with the fact that the intellect is, so to speak, an instrument of human self-preservation. Rather, he says, well, what's fascinating about the intellect as an instrument of preservation is that, as he says it in his early text, that it generates these illusory dissimulations, or these Verstellungen. So rather than truthful representation, which is the idea in German, the idea of Vorstellung, the intellect actually only produces dissimulations, Verstellungen. So for Nietzsche, this is actually not a problem, just he realizes that what we thought to be an instrument of truth and knowledge is actually a creative force of dissimulation. It creates illusions rather than knowledge. And so what he finds, I guess, as a characteristic of human life, but perhaps beyond the human, of all life, is that capacity to create illusions, and hence this creative capacity of life that is essential, not just to human self-preservation, perhaps, but of course it is particularly in the context of self-preservation that this instrument, the intellect and consciousness, excel. All right. So he speaks of a whole art of dissimulation that distinguishes human nature. And I'll just want to, I'll read you one little note here, because that is from his posthumous works. It's a note from the Nachlass, but from the very period as Truth and Lies in an extramoral sense. And we know that Nietzsche at the time, he was very interested in biology and the life sciences of the 19th century. So he positions this creative activity of dissimulation of the intellect, if you wish, within and sort of an understanding of life, or organic life, more broadly speaking. So he says, I read the quote, a more advanced physiology will surely confirm that the artistic forces inheres our becoming, not only in that of the human being, but also in that of the animal. It will say that the artistic begins with the organic. So there's, I think I probably don't need to add much more. Now, this insight is again interesting, and I tie this back to philosophical anthropology again, because philosophical anthropology will take as its starting point the acknowledgement of this continuity between human and other than human life, and understand the human being as a living, embodied being. All right. I think with respect to Nietzsche's conception of consciousness, I think I said at the very beginning that it is embedded within his critique or his discourses of social criticism, right? And perhaps it's worth noting that especially in the gay science, we can say that consciousness is really understood as a sort of a normative concept that fulfills the criteria of morally and legally binding standard to which individuals must submit themselves if they want to enjoy the privileges of a secure life in the society of others. And here is where Nietzsche associates, almost equals, consciousness with communication. So he will say that consciousness and its relation to communication and the normative foundation of society is sort of the main insight that he draws in the gay science. And he wants to say that really consciousness emerges or coincides with the foundation of society. So there's something, so he argues that consciousness must be understood like the intellect, like what we've heard before, as a response to the human being's relative inferiority with respect to other forms of life. It's, again, a means of preservation of human life, but also a sign of its relative weakness. But also he emphasizes this sort of need for communication as a means of self-preservation, again, and that basically we've developed consciousness only in response to this need to communicate. And if you are interested in the particular aphorism where Nietzsche talks about consciousness in this sense, it's a Gay Science aphorism 354. So I think in this particular aphorism, there is and I'll just read to you a bit from this aphorism. He basically says, and it's relevant for his conception of truth and as redlichkeit or probity or honesty. My thought is evidently that consciousness actually belongs not to the human being's existence as an individual, but rather to the community and herd aspect of his nature. That accordingly, it is finally developed only in its relation to its usefulness to community or herd. And that consequently, each of us, even with the best will of the world to understand ourselves as individually as possibly, to know ourselves, will bring to consciousness precisely that in ourselves, which is non-individual, that which is average. At bottom, all our actions are incomparably and utterly personal, unique, and boundlessly individual, there's no doubt. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they no longer seem to be. All becoming conscious involves a vast and thorough corruption, falsification, superficialization, and generalization. So same movement as in truth and lies in an extramoral sense. So we have, I think, one final aspect, and I'll come to an end on this particular concept, is that another moment, and that's also again in the Gay Science 110, Nietzsche will ask, which will raise the issue or the question of embodiment. So the connection between, I think the way that we can introduce the problem of embodiment is through the acknowledgement that neither truth nor consciousness and the intellect can be considered as idealities, if you wish, but they have to be understood through the lens of what Nietzsche calls the perspective of life, or in philosophical anthropology, you would say the sort of lived experience, a lived existence of the human being. So let me get to embodiment as the third concept that I promised I would talk a little bit about. And I see I hit the 30 minutes, so I'll be done before. I think you said I have 40 minutes, so I'll probably be done before that. So against all this background of what we've heard so far, we've heard the intellect is really sort of inferior type of tool. It doesn't give us access to the world. It doesn't produce any representation of the world, no really knowledge of the world, only dissimulations of the world. It does not actually advance the path of knowing yourself or of self-knowledge, because everything that's conscious is common and hence falsifying what is singular and individual. So against this background, Nietzsche will ask, well, how is truth possible at all? And he asks this question actually from the very beginning in the early text on truth and lies in an extramoral sense. And in the gay science, he will come back to this question, and it takes the form of the question of how and whether truth can be lived. So I said at the very beginning, when I was distinguishing between the three different discourses on truth, that Nietzsche is after an idea of the philosophical life where life and thought become inseparable. And if that is the case, if that is the kind of idea of philosophy, of the philosophical life that we are pursuing, then the question becomes, how can truth be lived? Which for Nietzsche, now life is not something abstract again, but it's something embodied, part of the living experience of the human being. How hence can truth be lived? How can truth be embodied? How is truth possible at all? How is knowledge possible at all? So here these are very radical gestures, because as Karl Löwit would say, that with Nietzsche, and he says with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, in fact, philosophy is no longer that discourse on the whole of on the world, but it really becomes entirely philosophical anthropology. So for Löwit, after the death of God, so to speak, that is, after the end of philosophy as a pursuit of absolute truth, the central question for philosophy, post-Nietzsche, so to speak, is what is the human being? So all questions of philosophy come, I was going to say, down to the question of what is the human being? And for Nietzsche in particular, it comes to the question which he in the gay science describes as actually a completely new question, as a question that we have not been aware of, have not become acknowledged or become aware of. In that extent is the question of the degree to which truth can be embodied and the degree to which truth can be lived. So if a philosophy is all concerned with the question of what is the human being, and then the answer to this question, according to Löwit and according to what I call sort of this discourse on philosophy as the philosophical life, then philosophy must become, or takes on the form, if you wish, what has been called an experimental psychology, where truths are produced by the living philosopher's self-experimentations. So philosophical anthropology, in a sense, withdraws the ground of philosophy as the pursuit of absolute truth, but it also announces this sort of new beginning of philosophy as philosophical anthropology. And what's particular about this approach is precisely that it considers, as I said already, I think, the human being as a living being that produces knowledge which is lived and reflected in nature. I jump forward a little bit because I want to get to my final questions. So, how are we going to understand this sort of living, the human being as a living being, and what does it mean for our pursuit of truth, and what does it mean for understanding of philosophy and consciousness? So I think the answer to this question turns around what I called a new philosophy of the body. And I would say that both Nietzsche's philosophy as a whole, as well as is in many ways comparable as well to Freud's approach to psychoanalysis, turns around the question of this new philosophy of the body. And I just want to make sort of three points with respect to this new conception of the body in Nietzsche. So the first is that for Nietzsche, the body becomes the place, if you wish, of interconnection between human life and other than human life. So you have many citations in Nietzsche where he will say that it's the whole history of organic life. I think if you recall, there's the famous one where he says the whole prehistory and past of all sentient being continues within me to fabulate, to love, to hate, and to infer. That's in Gay Science 55. He also speaks in a note from the Nachlass about this tremendous unheard stream of life that runs through, above, and beyond the human being's body, that really it is the role of the philosopher and the poet, if you wish, to extract and draw out. And he very often, as you know, is an ongoing theme, talks about needing to have the right ears and the right sensitivity to hear what has so far, I guess, been discarded by the history of Western philosophy, at least. So the first note is we need a different, I guess, sensibility to approach this aspect of life that, and that's the second point, always escapes us. So I think the second important point I want to make with respect to this new philosophy of life is that it draws a clear limit. And we find that limit as well made explicit by Freud when he talks about human drives. There's, in the end, we need to acknowledge that any history of human life will fail, there's always something that will remain unknown and unintelligible. And the final point I think is important to underline is that this approach to the human being, or this question of the human being that's central to Nietzsche's discourse on truth, consciousness as embodiment, is always also an overcoming of the human being. So there's I would say, an anti-humanist or a critique of anthropology that is part and parcel of Nietzsche's anthropology, to the extent that you could ask, is there an anthropology in all? Nietzsche does not use those terms, of course, And hence he speculates, and that's again from a note in the Nachlass, that in the end, it's not about the human being, it is about its overcoming. And so I think that is, the final point that we need to bear in mind when we think about the question of the nature of the human being, the question of what is the human being in relation to truth, consciousness, and embodiment. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for this really inspired talk. And we have some time for questions, but for me it was really interesting, this discussion on the philosophical anthropology of Friedrich Nietzsche and this connection of the organic and the new conception of the body, and makes sense, at least as far as I know, with his consideration of the pre-Socratics and his idea that they are the pre-Platonists. Actually, I think that perhaps he observed some kind of fragmentation with the Platonic philosophy as far as of his own time, he reads in his own time. So for me, it's extremely important, this observation, for also for a historiographical aspect. But I think we have 15 minutes for questions, and you can actually raise your hand. You can use, if you want something to ask Professor Vanessa Lemm. Okay, Franco, sorry for Franco wants to ask a question. Yes, please.
Yes, please. Well, thank you so much for the opening. It's very grateful and useful for me. I'm from Argentina. I'm from so far away. So to have the opportunity to keep contact and to listen these talks is very enlightenment for me. Well, I want to ask about the moral truth. I'm studying about moral truth in Nietzsche and trying to look in for a moral knowledge, an answer in perspectivism. So I wanted to ask you about if the notion of truth that you are arguing and you are explaining to us is related with the notion of consciousness and embodiment. That's one point. So the moral truth should need to be shared, to be explicated. I'm sorry, about consciousness and embodiment truth. It's like I'm thinking just when we are talking about truth in Nietzsche, I guess that we are talking about some ethics problem, some moral problem, some problem that we must find in some virtues, some social critical that Nietzsche used. And I guess that is related to the consciousness and with this moral psychology or this experimental psychology that he exposed in the genealogy, for example. Do you agree with that? What do you think?
All right, I'll try to. I'm not sure I understood the question, but I'll try to answer something, and then you can say yes, this is the right direction I was looking for. So I think the problem of moral truth, if we look at it from the perspective of this question of embodiment, is that I think there are two things. One is that from the perspective of life, error is actually not an issue. On the contrary, life thrives on errors. Yes, life does very well on errors. So dissimulation errors are in effect life preserving. They are in fact life enhancing. So there's, I guess, from this perspective, also a lot of, I guess, moral errors There may be errors, but they may be useful, they may be life-preserving, and a lot of the way that society functions and is organized may not be truthful, but it's useful, it works, all right? Now that's a dilemma for the philosopher, of course, because on the one hand, if we take this question of embodiment seriously, it means that all those errors, as Nietzsche says, they're really deeply ingrained, they're deeply embodied in the way we live. This is the way we've always done it. This is the way we do it when we get up in the morning. So why change anything? It's okay. We can keep going. And so the difficulty of philosophy is, on the one hand, how to go against, I guess, established habits, established ways of life, right? Even if they are unjust, even if they are wrong, even if they are, and so forth, yeah? But also, second, the need to, so to speak, prove with your example of the lived experience, and if we can think about the pre-Socratics again, that a different form of life is possible. So the philosopher needs to actually, it's not just about writing a book, but it's in this very, I guess, Greek sense of demonstrating an ethos and the way you dress, you eat, you walk, your whole life needs to basically reflect a different form of life, that it's not only possible, but also that it's actually a better form of life, a more, I guess, life-enhancing example of life. And that is where, I guess, the dilemma of moral truth comes in, because I think for Nietzsche, I think it's perhaps the second point to your question, is there's no final overcoming of error. Like we are constantly, there's a constant risk as well for the philosopher to, and Nietzsche talks about this throughout his, when he, for example, talks about his own writings, there's a risk of always falling back into ideological discourse, falling back into metaphysical discourse, and so forth. And it's a constant, I guess, struggle, but also a need to constantly overcome yourself and particular ways of life. And Nietzsche uses sort of the discourse of health and sickness, where these two are not opposites, but in fact they're part of a continuum, where he welcomes sickness as a way of finding yet another cure, of self-overcoming and so forth, that underpin the whole trajectory of his own philosophical production. But also, I think moral truth can be looked at from this lens of a, I guess, continuous, I guess, experimentation as well with different ways of living.
A short answer. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was I was trying to ask him. I have another question, but I wanna continue with the other guest.
Yes, we have some more. Thank you, Franco, and thank you, Vanessa. And Miss Angela Saffer wants actually to. Sorry if I don't spell correctly your name. There is a question, and there are 3 more questions. Let's hope that we will have the time to answer them. Yes, please, Angela. You're muted, actually. You're muted, yes. There's some connection problem. So we can move on to Maria Martinez. And Maria, would like to ask your question?
Yes, sure. Can you see me, right? Yes. So
yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I am not an expert in Nietzsche. I am a philosopher of science. And I wanted to ask something about the connection between this embodiment of the truth and which effect it has in science. Because it seems to me that then the recommendation would be to have something like a philosophical spirited scientist in the long run, right? And so I was wondering whether that is the case, and then which are the methodological effects of this embodiment of truth in the development of science, especially not necessarily in that science that involves the human body, so not biology, maybe not medicine, but the other ones, the ones about the cosmos, the ones that are a bit more abstract. So, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk.
Oh, look, thank you so much. I think it's a great question, and I would love to I have a lot, I could go on for a while. I try to make it short. So I know I think it's a great question. It's right to the point, because Nietzsche loves science. He doesn't want to give up science. He sees himself as a scientist. So I think I would agree with you. When we hear the term nature, we think that nature that's the realm of the natural sciences, and that philosophy and the human sciences have nothing to say about it. I think that's false. I think they're actually two different discourses. I think the natural sciences are, I think it's one way of thinking about it. They are interested in the functionality of life, or the functionality of the body, right? But Nietzsche, and I think also Freud, they're not interested in the functionality of the body, but they're interested actually in this, what Binswanger had called the inner history of life. So they're interested, basically, I guess there's a philosophical body, if you wish, that requires a different methodology and a different approach to tell the natural history of the human being within a kind of philosophical, and you could say even poetic, perhaps, a discourse. So I think the first need is we need to distinguish between the two, acknowledge that there are two different ways of talking about the human being and human nature. And I think in terms of methodology, I think it's a great question as well. And I think that Nietzsche, for him, his problem is that the philosopher is not scientific enough. He wants actually the philosopher to be more scientific, and that true science can always only be a continuous critique of science. Yeah? I mean, that's if you were the Enlightenment Nietzsche speaking, that really believes in continuous self-experimentation, and testing of truth, if you wish, but not in the abstract sense, but in a sort of real sense of experimenting with yourself, which is, you could say, is what Nietzsche did throughout his philosophy. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria, for this.
Thank you very much
for the question. And Muriki Ioana wants actually to ask a question. Ioana, you can ask a question.
Hello. Can you hear me? Is everything okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm still a student in high school, and I was actually doing one of my papers in Nietzsche's, and I was interested in his idea and the concept of homo natura. And I also read some parts of your work as well, which were very helpful. So it's very exciting for me to be in this meeting. I wanted to ask if consciousness kind of limits our understanding of human beings and also life or cosmos, as you explained it, does overcoming it mean becoming what his conception of the Übermensch is? And to what extent is this the way to overcome these limits set by consciousness and society, in a way?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. And I think you're right to ask this question, because is Nietzsche just throwing consciousness out of the window? Like, does he, is he looking, what is he after? And I would say he's not. I think this is was the English impression, like throwing the baby out with a bathwater. So he wants to hold on to consciousness, but the question is more like, how can you actually cultivate a different kind of consciousness, like a consciousness that would be truthful and honest, because otherwise philosophy would be impossible, right? He wants to hold on to the pursuit of truth. He wants to hold on to consciousness, but he observes that what we know as consciousness is in fact has very little to do with truth. It has very little to do with knowledge, and it's really plays on sort of I guess a more ideological function in preserving a certain political and social order, certain moral perspectives, and so forth and so forth. So I think his answer, I guess, is one of his answers is overcoming. Now, I don't read this idea of this Übermensch as an actual new human being. I know there are a lot of people who read Nietzsche as a sort of a transhumanist who aspires towards the creation of a new type of human being. I see it more as I think he's interested in this continuous potential for self-transformation, for self-overcoming, for self-transfiguration. And he says in an aphorism following the one that introduces Homo Natura, that the kind of knowledge that he is interested in and always has been interested in is only the kind of knowledge that transforms you. Everything else is really irrelevant. Yeah. So I think that consciousness as an open-ended movement and becoming is the kind of state that he is striving towards, acknowledging, of course, that it's almost inevitable to fall back into error, to fall back, and so forth. Otherwise, of course, overcoming wouldn't be continuously necessary.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you. Really, and there is a final. It's 9 o'clock. Maybe we have a couple of minutes for the final question from Mr. Andrew King. Andrew, would like to ask your question.
Hello, Vanessa. I don't know if you can see. I don't know if you recognize me, but we're going to be seeing each other very soon, I hope. Since the time is really going on, and I've got a series of quite really complicated questions, but I'll ask just one. What's the name of your adorable cat?
The name of my adorable cat is, actually, we just call her Katze.
Thank you. Listen, I realize time is going on. I'm sure you do, my questions are quite complicated about method. I'm sure I look forward to pursuing them over the coming months and years, I hope.
All
so
right.
thank
Wonderful.
you very much, Anna.
Thank
you very
much.
Thank
you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you very much. Just to say a very big thank you to Vanessa. We are also thankful here in the Institute and our participants today. It was really an inspired talk on a very key notion, gesture, as you said, of Nietzsche about consciousness, which is actually something like a philosophical trend, we have to say. That is why our series is devoted on intelligence and consciousness from the different perspectives, from different aspects and philosophical traditions. And your contribution on Nietzsche is very welcome, because it gives us really a different way to think about consciousness, communication, and the organic, the importance of the body and the philosophy of life. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much again for the invitation. And I really enjoyed the session, and Great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Thank you so much. Have a great time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.